The first commercially available arcade video game was Computer Space, which was released in 1971. However, a more recognizable title released in the following year. Pong was considered groundbreaking at the time, and by 1972, the American manufacturer behind it, Atari Inc., had sold more than 8,000 Pong arcade game machines. However, it wouldn't be until the early 1980s that reports of video game addiction would begin to appear in the psychological and psychiatric literature. One such report was by Ross, Feinstone, and Lavin, who reported 3 cases of Space Invaders obsession in the Journal of the American Medical Association. When I first read about this report, I assumed that the 3 people mentioned in the report were children. However, upon further research, I discovered that they were in fact 3 grown men, aged 35, 27, and 25 years old. The report found that each man reported a sharp increase in time, energy, and money devoted to playing Space Invaders in the immediate weeks before their respective marriages. Despite this, the first reference to video game addiction was in 1983 by Soper and Miller. Their depiction of video game addiction was far more familiar to me than the past depiction, as Soper and Miller focused on the emerging addiction among students. Now, as a teenager myself, and as someone who has played video games for the majority of my childhood, this report resonated more with me than the first, and the effects they talk about in the study seemed all too familiar. Based on their observations as school counselors, they claim that video game addiction disorder is like any behavioral addiction and involves a lack of interest in other activities, and that video game addicts would also associate and form friendship circles mainly with other video game addicts. However, these studies provide a somewhat limited look into video game addiction, as the medium through which the people referenced in the studies were playing games, paid to play arcade games, is vastly different to today's home console and home computer gaming experience. To examine some more relevant research, I'm going to jump straight to the 1990s. There was a significant increase of research into video game addiction during this period, and the studies mainly focused on the mediums of gaming that are still pretty much king today, these being the home console gaming and PC gaming. Unfortunately though, all of these studies assessed video game addiction using adaptive versions of the criteria for pathological gambling. While there are similarities between the two, many would argue that they are very different behaviors and that more specific screening instruments should have been developed. Okay, now I'm going to move on to discussing the 2000s. One of the biggest shifts in gaming that occurred during the 2000s was the introduction of true online multiplayer gaming. While multiplayer online gaming had been in its infancy during the 1990s and before that, it really began to gain popularity following the introduction of online multiplayer to the PlayStation 2 and later with the release of the Xbox in 2002, which offered online multiplayer by using Xbox Live. It was also around this time that titles like RuneScape and World of Warcraft were released on the PC. Approximately 60 studies were published on gaming addiction between the 2000 and 2010, and a vast majority of these examined MMORPG addiction. Massively multiplayer online games are usually at the root of most cases of video game addiction today, with an article from the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse called Online and Offline Video Game Use in Adolescence, Measurement in Invariance and Problem Severity, finding that according to the multiple indicators of multiple causes mimic model, online gamers were far more likely to score higher on overuse, interpersonal conflict, and social isolation subscales of the POGQ. Away from the academic literature, MMORPG games have been at the root of many high-profile cases of video game addiction and its consequences. Like, for example, the story of Qiu Changwei, a man in China who stabbed his friend in the chest after he found out he had sold his virtual sword, or the more sinister case of the Korean couple who let their 3-month-old child starve to death as they devoted their hours to raising a virtual character of a young girl. I would like to quote Chun Jin Won, a police officer on the incident, who said, "They indulged themselves in the online game of raising a virtual character so as to escape from reality, which led to the death of their real baby." Although both of these examples may seem crazy and sensationalist, I think they are a dark reminder of the dangers of becoming too immersed in an online world or the chasing of extreme escapism. However, many would argue that the 2010s were vastly different to the 2000s in terms of gaming, and a lot of prominent games were released during this period, which are still huge players in the market today, with Minecraft and Terraria both releasing in 2011. Another game that gets brought up a lot in modern cases of video game addiction was also released around the start of the 2010s, and this was League of Legends, which was released in 2009. This is something that I feel as though I have more experience with, since growing up in the late 2000s and early 2010s, I was born in 2003, exposed me to a lot of video games. I remember spending a fair bit of time playing on my Nintendo Wii and an old Sega Genesis Mega Drive that my nan had at her house. However, it wasn't until I started playing Roblox and Minecraft that my time spent on video games increased drastically, supporting the hypothesis that online games are worse than offline games for addiction. I remember playing for hours on survival multiplayer Minecraft servers and on early Roblox games like Pirate Wars and Natural Disaster Survival. This was back when Roblox had the option to play as a guest. Later in my early teens, I remember playing a lot of League of Legends alongside Minecraft and Roblox. I never really got into World of Warcraft, but in the last couple of years I did play quite a bit of Albion Online, another MMORPG style game that was released more recently in 2017. I've never really considered myself addicted, and fortunately I really don't play that much anymore. However, I do remember playing almost all day some days when I was younger. I'm also pretty certain this wasn't just something I had dealt with, and I'm sure a lot of my friends also remember playing games a lot. I think growing up in the environment that I did, and with the level of exposure to video games that I had, really gave me a more in-depth insight into what draws people to games in the first place. I think this nostalgia and genuine love for games also leads me to be careful not to make this video overly critical, as in my personal experience, games aren't always that bad. I think, like most things, the key is moderation. The World Health Organization included gaming disorder in the 11th revision of the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, which was approved by the World Health Assembly in May 2019. For many, the World Health Organization's categorization of gaming disorder helped to legitimize the condition. They define it as a pattern of persistent or recurrent gaming behavior so severe that it takes precedence over other life interests. With that in mind, let's take a look into the world of treatment for video game addiction. The main style of treatment for video game addiction seems to be cognitive behavioral therapy. However, other types of therapy, like family and group therapy, are also commonplace. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a talking therapy which is often used to treat many kinds of addiction, and supporters of the therapy argue that it can really help people dealing with video game addiction to develop healthier thinking patterns. Outside of the typical therapy style of treatment, there are many other more extreme forms of treatment. One such form is the video game addiction or internet addiction bootcamp. While these camps vary in severity and also treatment style, some have garnered media attention for their tough approach on game addiction. Most of the stories discussing these bootcamps are describing bootcamps within China, and it isn't that hard to see why. According to this article titled "Inside Chinese Bootcamps Designed to Break Video Game Addiction," Chinese parents, psychiatrists, and media often describe Wangyan or internet addiction as a clinical disorder. Sometimes called digital heroin, it is said to afflict 24 million young people. The article goes on to describe some of the treatments used in this one Chinese facility led by Tao Ran, a former army colonel, including brain scans, medication, and strict militaristic style routines. These methods may seem extreme, but according to Tao, his team's methods have a 75% success rate. However, it must also be considered that the news out of these extreme boot camps is not always as cheery and is successful as this statistic may lead you to believe. One such example of abuse happening within these camps is described in an article published by the Washington Post titled "A Teen Checked into an Internet Addiction Boot Camp in China. He was dead 2 days later." This article details the story of Liao, an 18-year-old man living in Anhui province. His parents checked their son into the Fuyang Internet Addiction Center. It was here that he was beaten by the staff at the facility. These injuries that he sustained later led to his death in hospital. While this may be a rare occurrence, it can show the kind of abuses that can occur in China's controversial internet addiction boot camps. An alternative treatment method, wilderness therapy, has been used in some cases to treat video game addiction. This sort of therapy seeks to separate the addict from the cause of their addiction. In this context, video games and computer or console access. Supporters of this treatment also believe that it helps people suffering from video game addiction to learn to be comfortable with their own emotions, and that it may be a useful counterweight for the seeking of escapism into fantasy worlds that may be at the root of a lot of cases of video game addiction. The treatment that I'm going to be discussing next may be somewhat controversial, considering that the clinical trials are still in the early stages, but according to psychguides.com, there is some indication that certain medications help video game addicts by altering their brain chemistry to reduce the urge to play. One drug that the website claims has appeared to offer help to some addicts is bupropion, which helps by inhibiting norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake. Alongside this, according to psychguides.com, many video game addicts appear to suffer from undiagnosed depression or anxiety disorders as well. So once they receive help for these issues, perhaps in the form of medication, they may have a better chance of overcoming their video game addiction. To conclude, video game addiction has been documented in the psychiatric and psychological literature since the 1980s. However, cases of video game addiction and the amount of research into the condition and its treatment have increased dramatically since the beginning of the 2000s, and this trend does not seem to be slowing down. As time goes on, more and more children will be exposed to video games from a very early age. Since the addiction to video games is becoming so well documented, I think it's very important that children's exposure to video games is somewhat moderated by their parents in order to prevent them developing an addiction to games and stunting their personal development and growth. I also think that on the topic of treatment, video game addicts and the people around them should be cautious not to pursue a treatment that could be potentially very harmful to the addict, and should instead ask a professional and do their own research on the subject, and from that make a well-informed decision on how they should approach their own addiction or the addiction of someone around them. I also think that when treating video game addiction, it is very important to analyse what is leading somebody to develop such a high dependency on games. This could be the result of a bigger underlying issue that should definitely be addressed in order to help someone addicted to video games break their addiction and develop more healthier thinking patterns. With that brief summary out of the way, I would like to end this video by posing a question to you. What are your thoughts on video game addiction and its treatment? I encourage you to leave your answers in the comment section below, as I'm curious as to what others think on the matter. This is where I'm going to end the video. If you enjoyed this video and you want to support my channel and me as a content creator, then please consider liking, commenting and subscribing.